My favorite thing about this sermon series is the music. If we could just sit and sing spirituals together for an hour on a Sunday evening, I would be filled and content. So maybe we need to talk about doing that sometime if you're in the same boat. I am in the middle of a sermon series. I preach on the lectionary, which is the ascribed text of the church. And over the summer, the Old Testament lesson for each week were these great stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs of Genesis. So I did this sermon series called Campfire Series, where we walked with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph all the way to Egypt. And then we're like, well, we have to stop the Campfire Series, and Greg is preaching at the 9:30, and it's not a big deal. What's next anyway? And it was Exodus. And I love Exodus. And I've taken extra classes just on the book of Exodus because I love Exodus. And it's been such an important book to so many different traditions and to some of the concepts we're going to talk about today that have not been always great concepts, things like American exceptionalism. We'll get there. But I love Exodus. And it's spoken so greatly into our lives. And so there were 10 weeks of Exodus text. And I was like, I can't do that again. I cannot drag people through 10 weeks of one book again. So instead, I took two weeks each week, and I'm bumping them up. And so before we hear today's scripture, we're just going to do a little recap, right? So after the patriarchs of Genesis, we ended with Joseph and his brothers and their family were taken down to Egypt during the drought. And there they remained, and they were fine for a while, until a new Pharaoh rose over Egypt that did not know Joseph and did not know those ancestors. And eventually, the new Pharaoh became a taskmaster over the future Israelites, over the Hebrew people. And they remained slaves in Egypt for generations, where they multiplied and multiplied, until a man named Moses comes along. And Moses was Hebrew, but he was raised in the king's courts by the Pharaoh's daughter and by the Pharaoh. And after a little squabble where he took the life of an Egyptian, he fled Egypt and returned after God told him that his calling on his life was going to be to free the Hebrew people, to free them from Egypt and to bring them into the promised land. No small task, especially for someone who is on the run. But it all works, and there's a few movies about it. Some of them are cartoons, and some of them have the heads of the NRA in them, but they're all of their time period for sure. And to be fair, Exodus is a story that's retold and retold by every generation anyway, so it's kind of appropriate. So after Moses and his siblings, Miriam and Aaron, free the people from Pharaoh, and there's this big scene where they cross on dry land through a sea. You might remember this part, right? And they end up on the other side. They begin their travels into the wilderness. And that's where Hannah started us last week. And the idea of the wilderness is that even though the people were free in their flesh, they were not free in their minds. They had the sermon that I did about them leaving Egypt was called "Let My People Go." And then last week the sermon was called "My People, Let Go." Because, they kept saying, the food, we don't know where our food's coming from, and we don't know where the water is coming from, and at least we knew what life was like, and we had some sense of security in Egypt, even if we were slaves. It's about, the thing that'll get you free, is not the same thing that will help you survive. And they wanted to survive, and they didn't know if they were going to survive, but if you just stay in that survival mode the whole time, then you will never get free. And so that's where we were last week. And now we are getting a little bit kind of deeper into this relationship between God and the Hebrew people. You have to remember that by the time that the book of Exodus comes around, it says that the people forgot who their God was essentially, but God never forgot them. They had forgotten the God of their ancestors. And so they were getting to know this God again for the first time, which is why there's some doubts and anxiety and trust issues, right? There is a theologian and biblical scholar named Terence Fretheim who has written tons on the book of Exodus. And he often talks about this time in the wilderness of the Israelites, the Hebrew people in the wilderness, is like the Hebrew people's teenage years. That they really want independence, but they are unable to handle it, even though they swear up and down this time it's going to be different. How they are completely dependent on God and always like needing kind of the permission from Moses to be able to even feel comfortable, but also swear up and down that they don't need that kind of help. It's the kind of independence that only dependents can have, right, and crave. And it's a really great way, I think, to think about kind of where we can be in our faith as far as like a maturity level in our faith, and that could be for an individual or as well as a community. I think it's a really great reference that this is kind of their teenage years, or maybe a better way to talk about it is just that they're in the earlier stages of their relationship with God. In the earlier stages of their relationship. And the early stages of any relationship are unique. Because, number one, people are not always authentic at the beginning. You ever feel like, when I was still dating, it's like the first 3 dates is not really you. It's like you've sent your ambassador. And you're like, let me tell you about this person. Like the vacations are great, it's absolutely beautiful, perfect weather all the time, but then as the relationship goes forward, you begin to learn more about each other. And you begin to build some trust and some authenticity. And at some point, you have to say, like, what are we doing here? What are the ground rules between us? Like, is it just going to be us? Like, have we come that far? Like, what baggage are you bringing to the table? What's your family like? Are they going to be okay with me coming over to dinner? What about what I do for a living? And you begin to have these boundaries come up and these very healthy ideas about rules. There's kind of rules you put into your relationship. I'm building this up here because today we're going to talk about law, which doesn't sound like that hot of a topic to talk about, right? Nobody wants to come to church to hear about the law of God. But I promise it's actually a really, really important lesson. It's a really important lesson, and the thing about the law of God is that it's very similar to this kind of relationship thing. I think a lot of us, when we hear about like rules and laws, we have this image of this God who's like just putting the rules down to wait for us to like break the rule so that God can then come punish us. There's like this punishing kind of God, like if you do these things, then, I'm going to be angry at you and shake my fist at you. But that wasn't the root of it. It was back to that loving relationship thing. It was like, we've been doing this for a minute, and I'm your God and you're my people. So what kind of boundaries should we have? So we're going to go ahead and, there's 2 scriptures printed in our bulletin today. We're only going to hear the first. I'll reference the second. So Joseph, if you could go ahead and read us this first part from the 20th chapter of Exodus is just excerpts of the 10 Commandments.
Okay. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid, and trembled, and stood at a distance, and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you, and to put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
These 10 Commandments are often referred to as the Decalogue. There's your word for the day. Deca, like 10. There you go. You went to seminary tonight. The Decalogue. Again, I don't remember this being introduced to me as a list of like a loving relationship list. But I'm asking you to see it like that this evening and to kind of, if that's new for you, to stretch yourselves. Also, because I found it helpful, I have read 4 books on the Ten Commandments, and this is the best thing I found in all 4 books. This is, for those of you who don't have a copy, I have more in the back, and I've got extra, and I'll reference it a couple times, but I'll just read it to you now. I like this rewritten version. So this is like a modern version. The first commandment, do not have more than a single ultimate allegiance. Number 2, do not give ultimate loyalty to any earthly reality. Number 3, do not use the power of religion to harm others. Number 4, do not treat with contempt the times set aside for rest. Praise be. Number 5, do not treat with contempt members of the family. Number 6, do not do violence against fellow human beings. Number 7, do not violate the commitment of sexual love. Number 8, do not claim the life or goods of others. Number 9, do not damage others through the misuse of human speech. And lastly, number 10, do not lust after the goods or life of others. I like this. The law of God, the purpose of the law of God, once they were building this relationship, but the purpose of the law of God, which we hear over and over throughout the Old Testament, was that the law was supposed to help people keep God at the center of their lives. Okay, like if you followed the law, then God was at the center of all of your decisions on how you treated your community, on how you worked government, about everything. The law was supposed to help the people keep God at the center of their lives. It was supposed to help them to focus on what was really important. It was supposed to honor and nurture their relationships, not the opposite. It was supposed to help them build trust, not the opposite. The law was supposed to remind them of who God was and who they were, and that they were not God, nor were the things built by their hands. See, one of the reasons that we have the law is because we're also going to have golden calves. Now, this is the second scripture for today, but I'm not going to read it to you. I'm not going to make you listen to it. I'm just going to retell it to you. Moses goes away for a bit to pray and be on a mountain with God. And in his absence, the people, not having the leadership perhaps that they need, they kind of flip out and they go to Aaron, Moses' brother, and like, give us something to worship, basically. So Aaron takes all of their gold jewelry and melts it down and makes them a golden calf. And they praise it, and it could be kind of like an Ark of the Covenant idea where like on the ark, like the idea was that the Ark of the Covenant, like God could sit on the wings, like maybe like God would sit on the calf, and maybe that's why they were imagining the golden calf. We don't know exactly. But we do know that this is not okay. And the most difficult part, and this sentence is like the exact same sentence as the first part of what we heard at the Ten Commandments. Aaron says, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." Now, this is the problem, right? Here's the big problem. These are the gods that brought you up from the land of Egypt. Basically, what happens is God tells Moses, you need to go down there right now. This is not okay. And so Moses runs down and kind of calls them out for what they've done. But I always found that particular line in the story, that not only are they praising this golden calf, but they're doing it like in the name of the thing that the actual God did for them. These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Because the thing is, that's just a lie. This calf did not bring them up from the land of Egypt. There was only one thing that gave liberation and freedom to the people. Just as today, there is still only one thing that really gives liberation and freedom to people, and that is God. We may be quick to cast aside the Israelites and to assume that we would never partake in such an obvious sin. But the thing about golden calves is that they are deeply deceiving. Sure, they're man-made. That should be our first sign, right? It's not God because it's man-made. But it does take a whole bunch of people kind of working together to come up with the calf. And that's a good thing. Building community together, all of us bringing our resources together to do something that would be like praiseworthy and holy, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, right? And then we have this ritual of sacrificing that they were going to do around the calf. You know, people have a connection with their needs for ritual. There's a very good chance in Moses' absence that the people were deeply in need for a sense of ritual and perhaps for a sense of sacrifice. You know, sacrifices normally are holy, just as rituals are. And lastly, with this golden calf, they added the narrative of freedom. They added their actual narrative, their actual story of freedom. And they put it on the calf. See, it's not a false story. This is the thing about idols. It's not a false story. They are indeed a people who were liberated out of the land of Egypt. They were just not liberated by this particular thing. This thing, this calf, is not the thing that freed them. I have this new intern starting this week, okay? And for those of you who know, I had 10 interns over the summer. I hire young adult interns to learn about more about Christianity and to talk about leadership development in the United Methodist Church. And I'm not very picky, and it's a passion of mine. So the first thing I ask them, like we talk about expectations. They'll learn about United Methodism. They'll have to do devotional, spiritual stuff. But I ask them about what they want to study. And I have an intern starting this week who had heard me having a side conversation sometime over the summer. And he was like, what's that thing about where some people believe that like being a good American is the same thing as being a good Christian? Or that being a good Christian means that you're a good American. And I was like, oh, he heard that conversation, great. I was like, oh, so like civil religion and like American exceptionalism, but civil religion? And he said, I don't know that term, which I wasn't surprised because it's not one that we teach in school. But civil religion is basically the idea that like being a good Christian is being a good American and that these terms are interchangeable. And that to bow to the cross and the triune God is very similar or almost interchangeable with bowing to the U.S. government. Civil religion tells us that our identity as Americans is either equal to or dependent on our identity as Christians, and vice versa, okay? And there is a whole bunch of history about this and how it happened in our nation, and there's hundreds of years of propaganda that propped it up, but it's there, right? And the thing is, it has a lot of similarities to this golden calf, all right? Like the golden calf, it's man-made. But it did take a whole bunch of people working together to come up with the calf, right? And that's not bad. That's not bad that a whole lot of people came together to organize and to build something and to build a nation and to come together and like really try to strive for something good that can even complement the kind of calling that God's put on our lives and heart. And then we have these like rituals and this concept of sacrificing. You know, we can talk about the actual bodies and blood that have been given to this nation, that have fought for freedoms. We can also talk about just blood, sweat, and tears of generations in particular bodies that were exploited or ones that just worked really hard and didn't, you know, people that have given their entire lives to building this up, whether they asked for that or not. You know, the rituals of sacrificing. That's there. We have that. And we have these kind of other rituals too, right? We've got like the rituals of this country with our like kind of our holidays and our songs and our symbols. And again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. All right? And lastly, we have the narrative of freedom, which again, in and of itself is not bad. But the calf is still man-made. And it serves a purpose, and it gives us comfort. But the second that we bow to it, it becomes idol worship. And that is dangerous. It's a dangerous line. And you know, even from when I'm writing this, I'm like, I hear the voice of my Father going, you know, if there's veterans in the room, you have got to be careful right now. Because that line is so dangerous. to be able to say, I acknowledge your sacrifice and what you have given, right? But that's not God. But America is not God. I know it's a thin and difficult line. And yet, I think it's a really good example of a golden calf. I do. The calf is man-made. It serves a purpose. It gives us comfort. But the second we bow to it, it's idol worship. When we begin to forget who God is in that kind of way, what's happening is we're breaking the first two commandments. And kind of the third, right? Number one was don't have more than one ultimate allegiance. And number two was don't give ultimate loyalty to any earthly reality. Or better said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above or on earth beneath, or that is under the water. And just like the Ten Commandments, as they show us, as soon as we begin to forget who God really is, and as soon as God is no longer the being at the center of our lives, it's really easy to begin having our relationships with other things fall apart too. It's really easy to get into like us versus them, right? When we forget who God is, then it's like me versus you, or those people versus those people, or maybe like me versus time and my lack of respect for my time of my day. You know, it's somewhere in here soon. The idol of work. The idea that like I have to work 7 days a week or the entire universe is going to fall apart because God can order the universe but not my calendar, right? That's absolutely insane. But I have this idea that like when I forget who God is and who I am, then all of a sudden I can be very busy with my hands and I don't respect the Sabbath, which has way more to do about me remembering that I'm a person and who God is than about the actual thing that I'm doing, right? Or like we get so caught up in our busyness with work or with stress and stuff that we don't take care of those primary relationships in our lives, whether that's with your kids or your parents or your spouse or that friend, you know, because we have forgotten who God is, and when we forget who God is, we forget who we are and what our identity is about. You know, the law of God gets such a bad rap, but there's a reason that we have it. Our idols are so easy to fall down and bow to. And it's not because a lot of them are evil or wretched. Often our idols are not actually evil. Sometimes they're good, but they're not God. Again, it's like that thing that can help you survive, but not the thing that can get you free. The issue with the idols is that they're made by us and not God. So when we bow to them, we're giving them power they don't have. We're playing pretend, and it's not real. It's just the thing we want. Again, often our idols are not evil. They're good. Like work, right? Working's good. Working so much that you think the world will fall apart if you take one day off, that's comparable to thinking that you're God. Being angry at injustice and systematic issues, that's good. You should be angry. That's biblical, all right? Raising your fist in violence is breaking the commandment, right? Forgetting who God is and who the people are. I know not everyone's going to agree with me on that one either. That's fine. The Israelites in the story, the thing is, they're not bad people. They just forgot. And we are much more like the Israelites than we are like Moses, for sure. They're not bad people, they just forgot. They forgot who they were and whose they were, and they got scared, perhaps. So they tried to recreate the thing that gave them the most comfort. You know, they tried to recreate that God. And you know, idolization is the biggest form of flattery. They wanted that thing back. But it wasn't up to them. It's not up to them. I'm going to, before I finish this sermon off, I want to read this excerpt from, I love Frederick Buechner, for anybody who's ever heard of him. He's a theologian and a scholar, and he has this wonderful daily devotion called Let Your Life Speak, and this is from that. And it talks a little bit further than where we are in our story of the nation of Israel, but I think it gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. Israel did not want to be a holy nation. Israel wanted to be a nation like all the other nations, a nation like Egypt, like Syria. She wanted clout. She wanted security. She wanted a place in the sun. It was her own way she wanted, not God's way. And when the prophets got after her for it, she got rid of the prophets. And when God's demands seemed too exorbitant, God's promises too remote, she took up with all the other gods who still get our votes and our money and our 9-to-5 energies, because they are gods who could not care less whether we are holy or not, and promise us absolutely everything we really want and absolutely nothing that we really need. I was so indicted when I read that. You know, if God is really a God whose law is rooted in love, unlike the false gods, and God isn't just making, the rules for us to break them so she can punish us. If these things are truly rooted in relationship, I think we might need to acknowledge the kind of heartbreak it must bring God when we turn away from God and from each other. It's not just flimsy rules. It's heartbreak. It's broken relationship that God's done everything to reconcile with, even through Christ. We don't tell our kids and the kids in our lives not to run into the street because we're trying to keep them from having fun. It's because we want to keep them alive and relatively safe. It's because we love them, right? And I think that's just the main part about the law that we often forget. There are laws and rules that some people make for us, people and systems who genuinely do not care about your well-being. They're looking at columns of numbers and statistics, and that's their job, right? There are people who make rules and laws to gain power, more power for themselves and more power over others. But God is like a parent who loves his children more than anything. And this God gives us the law, not so that she can get more power to shake his finger in our faces, but because this parent really, really, honestly, genuinely loves us all the way to death. Amen.